March 10, 2019. Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302 lifts off from Addis Ababa, bound for Nairobi. On board are 149 passengers and 8 crew members. The aircraft is a Boeing 737 MAX 8, one of the newest, most advanced planes in commercial aviation. 6 minutes later, the aircraft plunges into a field southeast of the city. There are no survivors. It is the second time in 5 months that a brand new 737 MAX has fallen from the sky. Within days, aviation authorities around the world ground the entire 737 MAX fleet. Nearly 400 aircraft sit idle on tarmacs from Seattle to Singapore. The grounding will last 20 months, the longest in modern aviation history. For Boeing, the world's largest aerospace company, it is an unprecedented crisis. For the families of 346 victims, it is an unspeakable tragedy. And for the flying public, it raises a terrifying question: how did 2 brand new aircraft, equipped with the latest technology, simply fall from the sky? To understand what happened, we must go back 5 months earlier. October 29, 2018. Lion Air Flight 610 departs Jakarta, Indonesia, on a routine domestic flight. 13 minutes after takeoff, the Boeing 737 MAX 8 crashes into the Java Sea. All 189 people on board are killed. The aircraft had been delivered to Lion Air just 2 months earlier. Investigators immediately begin searching for answers in one of the deepest and most challenging recovery operations in aviation history. Boeing's history is inseparable from the history of flight itself. Founded in 1916, the company built bombers that helped win World War II, introduced the first commercial jetliner, and created the 747, the iconic jumbo jet that democratized air travel. For generations, Boeing represented American engineering excellence. Its aircraft were considered the safest in the sky. The company's unofficial motto, "If it's not Boeing, I'm not going," reflected deep trust among pilots and passengers alike. That trust was built over decades. At the heart of Boeing's commercial success sits the 737. First introduced in 1967, it became the best-selling commercial jetliner in history. Over 10,000 have been built. Airlines loved its reliability and efficiency. Pilots appreciated its handling characteristics. The 737's design was refined through multiple generations: the Classic, the Next Generation, and eventually the MAX. Each iteration improved upon the last while maintaining a core philosophy: evolution, not revolution. Keep what works. Change only what you must. But by 2010, Boeing faced a problem. Its European rival, Airbus, announced the A320neo, a re-engined version of its popular narrow-body jet that promised 20% better fuel efficiency. Airlines were captivated. In a business where fuel costs can make or break profitability, 20% was transformative. Orders poured in. Boeing had a choice: design an entirely new aircraft from scratch, a process that would take a decade and cost tens of billions, or do what Airbus did, upgrade the 737 with new, more efficient engines. Boeing's leadership faced intense pressure from Wall Street and from its biggest customer, American Airlines, which was on the verge of ordering hundreds of A320neos. Boeing couldn't afford to wait 10 years to develop an all-new aircraft. It needed an answer now. In 2011, Boeing committed to the 737 MAX, a re-engined version of its 50-year-old design. The promise: deliver the same fuel efficiency as the Airbus Neo, but faster to market and with minimal retraining for pilots already qualified on earlier 737 models. The new engines were larger and more efficient, but they created an unexpected complication. The 737 sits low to the ground, a design feature dating back to the 1960s when airports lacked the tall jetways we see today. The bigger engines couldn't fit in the usual position under the wings. Boeing's solution was to move them forward and slightly higher. This seemingly minor adjustment changed the aircraft's aerodynamics in a subtle but significant way. Under certain conditions, the nose would pitch up more than on previous 737 models. Boeing's engineers developed a software solution. They created a system called MCOS, the Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation System. MCOS was designed to automatically push the nose down if sensors detected the aircraft was approaching a dangerous angle of attack, making the MAX feel like earlier 737s to pilots. In theory, it was elegant, a software patch to solve a hardware challenge. The system would run in the background, invisible to pilots, activating only in rare circumstances. It seemed like the perfect answer to keep pilot training requirements minimal and deliver the MAX to market quickly. But MCOS had a critical flaw in its implementation, and an even more critical flaw in its disclosure. Boeing didn't prominently feature MCOS in pilot manuals. Many pilots who flew the MAX didn't even know the system existed. Boeing's rationale was that MCOS was a background system that pilots wouldn't need to know about under normal operations. The company wanted to avoid requiring expensive simulator training, which would eliminate one of the MAX's key selling points, that pilots certified on older 737s could transition to the MAX with minimal additional training. MCOS relied on data from the aircraft's angle of attack sensors, vane-like devices on the fuselage that measure how steeply the nose points relative to oncoming air. The 737 MAX had two of these sensors, one on each side of the fuselage. But Boeing designed MCOS to rely on input from only one sensor at a time. There was no comparison between the two, no cross-check, no redundancy. If that single sensor malfunctioned and sent faulty data, MCOS would respond to information that didn't reflect reality. And the pilots wouldn't know why. The day before Lion Air Flight 610 crashed, the same aircraft experienced severe problems on a flight from Bali to Jakarta. The angle of attack sensor was sending erroneous data. MCOS activated repeatedly, pushing the nose down again and again. The pilots fought the aircraft, pulling the nose up manually. Fortunately, an off-duty pilot was in the cockpit jump seat. He recognized what was happening and told the crew to disable the electrical trim system, a procedure that deactivated MCOS. The aircraft landed safely. The sensor was not replaced. The next morning, Flight 610 departed with a different crew. The faulty sensor was still sending bad data. MCOS activated moments after takeoff, pushing the nose down. The pilots pulled back, raising the nose. MCOS activated again. And again. And again. More than 20 times in 13 minutes, the pilots fought the invisible system, not understanding what was commanding the aircraft to dive. They searched through checklists, trying to diagnose the problem. They never thought to disable the electrical trim. At 13 minutes, they lost the fight. The aircraft hit the water at over 400 miles per hour. Indonesian investigators recovered the flight data recorder from the Java Sea floor. The data told a horrifying story: a malfunctioning sensor, a software system the pilots didn't know existed, and a desperate struggle against an aircraft that was commanding itself to crash. Boeing issued a bulletin to airlines reminding pilots of the procedure to disable electrical trim in the event of uncommanded trim movement. The company maintained that pilots trained on runaway stabilizer procedures should be able to handle MCOS malfunctions. But Boeing still didn't fully explain what MCOS was or how it worked. Boeing's response focused on pilot error and maintenance issues at Lion Air. Company officials suggested that if the crew had simply followed the proper procedures for runaway stabilizer trim, a scenario pilots trained for, they could have saved the aircraft. The implication was clear: the problem wasn't the MAX or MCOS, it was inadequate pilot training at a budget airline in a developing country. Many in the aviation industry, accustomed to trusting Boeing's engineering judgment, accepted this narrative. The 737 MAX continued flying. No additional training was mandated. No changes were made to MCOS. Ethiopian Airlines was not a budget carrier with questionable training standards. It was Africa's largest and most respected airline, with a strong safety record and well-trained pilots. The airline operated a modern fleet and maintained rigorous training protocols. Its pilots were experienced professionals. When Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302 crashed on March 10, 2019, following an almost identical flight profile to Lion Air 610, the industry could no longer dismiss the crashes as isolated incidents caused by pilot error. The problem was the aircraft itself. Flight 302's flight data recorder revealed a chilling similarity to Lion Air. A faulty angle of attack sensor. MCOS activating based on erroneous data. Pilots fighting to control the aircraft as it repeatedly commanded itself to dive. The Ethiopian crew had read Boeing's bulletin after the Lion Air crash. They recognized the runaway stabilizer condition. They followed Boeing's recommended procedure and disabled the electrical trim system. But they faced an additional challenge the Lion Air crew never encountered, one that would prove fatal. When MCOS drove the Ethiopian aircraft's nose down, the plane accelerated rapidly in the dive. By the time the pilots disabled the electrical trim system, cutting power to MCOS, they were traveling at extremely high speed. The aircraft's nose was pointed sharply downward. To manually raise the nose using the trim wheels, the backup mechanical system, required enormous physical force at high speeds. The pilots couldn't generate enough force to turn the wheels. They briefly re-enabled electrical trim to help raise the nose. MCOS immediately reactivated and commanded another dive. They never recovered. Within 3 days of the Ethiopian crash, every aviation authority in the world grounded the 737 MAX. China was first. Europe followed. The United States Federal Aviation Administration initially resisted, but mounting pressure from pilots, flight attendants, and the traveling public forced the agency to act. On March 13, 2019, the FAA grounded the entire U.S. MAX fleet. It was an extraordinary moment. The world's aviation authorities, acting in near unanimity, had declared that Boeing's newest aircraft was unsafe to fly. For Boeing, it was a corporate catastrophe. 346 people lost their lives in the two crashes. They were businesspeople and tourists, aid workers and students, families and friends. Each had boarded a brand new Boeing aircraft with every expectation of a safe flight. Their families demanded answers. How could this happen? How could two brand new aircraft, built by one of the world's most trusted manufacturers, simply fall from the sky? How could Boeing and regulators allow a fatally flawed system to be installed in aircraft carrying hundreds of passengers? The questions demanded accountability. The United States Congress launched investigations. Internal Boeing documents emerged that shocked even seasoned aviation professionals. Emails and messages revealed that Boeing employees had discussed concerns about MCOS during development. Some engineers questioned the reliance on a single sensor. Test pilots noted that MCOS behavior could be confusing in certain scenarios. But these concerns were minimized or dismissed. The overriding priority was keeping the MAX on schedule and avoiding requirements for expensive simulator training, which would undermine the aircraft's competitive position against the Airbus A320neo. Among the most damaging revelations were messages from Boeing's chief technical pilot for the 737. In a 2016 exchange, he described MCOS behaving erratically in a simulator and using colorful language to describe misleading regulators. The messages suggested a corporate culture where schedule and cost considerations overshadowed engineering rigor. Other documents revealed that Boeing had calculated that requiring simulator training for the MAX would cost airlines tens of millions of dollars per aircraft, potentially making the MAX uncompetitive. Boeing had designed MCOS, in part, to avoid that training requirement. Investigators also scrutinized the Federal Aviation Administration. The FAA had certified the 737 MAX as safe. But the agency's certification process had changed dramatically over the decades. Facing budget constraints and pressure to speed certifications, the FAA had increasingly delegated authority to manufacturers themselves. Boeing employees, working under FAA oversight, had performed much of the MAX safety analysis. The system, known as Organization Designation Authorization, was intended to leverage industry expertise. Critics argued it had created conflicts of interest and compromised safety oversight. Many observers traced the problems to a fundamental shift in Boeing's corporate culture. In 1997, Boeing merged with McDonnell Douglas, a struggling competitor. Executives from McDonnell Douglas, known for prioritizing financial metrics over engineering excellence, rose to leadership positions. Boeing moved its headquarters from Seattle, where its aircraft were built, to Chicago, physically separating executive leadership from the engineering teams. Wall Street analysts praised the moves. Longtime Boeing engineers lamented them. The company's focus, they said, had shifted from building the best aircraft to maximizing shareholder returns. The 737 MAX itself embodied this cultural shift. Rather than designing an entirely new aircraft optimized for modern engines and aerodynamics, Boeing had stretched a 50-year-old design beyond its original parameters. The decision was driven by business considerations, speed to market, minimizing development costs, and avoiding pilot retraining requirements. These were legitimate business concerns. But they led to engineering compromises: the awkward engine placement, the need for MCOS, the reliance on a single sensor, that would prove catastrophic. Boeing's engineers had been asked to solve with software what ideally required a clean sheet hardware design. Boeing began the long process of fixing MCOS. Engineers redesigned the system to receive input from both angle of attack sensors, not just one. If the sensors disagreed significantly, MCOS would not activate. The system's authority was limited; it could no longer command repeated nose-down inputs. Pilots would receive additional training specifically on MCOS and how to respond if it malfunctioned. The changes were extensive. Boeing conducted thousands of hours of test flights. But the grounding stretched on. Airlines lost billions in revenue. Boeing's reputation suffered damage that might take generations to repair. In November 2020, after 20 months, the FAA approved the 737 MAX to return to service. Other regulators around the world conducted their own independent reviews before clearing the aircraft. The European Union Aviation Safety Agency and other authorities imposed additional requirements beyond the FAA's. The message was clear: the world's aviation regulators would no longer simply defer to American certification. Boeing had lost the automatic trust it once enjoyed. The MAX returned to the skies, but the industry had fundamentally changed. Boeing faced massive legal and financial consequences. The company reached a settlement with the Department of Justice, agreeing to pay over $2.5 billion in fines and compensation. Boeing admitted that employees had deceived regulators about MCOS. Separately, Boeing compensated airlines for the grounding's financial impact and established a fund for victims' families. The company's CEO resigned. Multiple executives left. Criminal charges were filed against Boeing's former chief technical pilot for the 737. The legal fallout reinforced that the crashes were not simply tragic accidents, but the result of conscious decisions. The MAX crisis exposed deep flaws in aircraft certification processes. Regulators had allowed manufacturers too much control over evaluating their own products. The cozy relationship between Boeing and the FAA had created blind spots. Congress passed legislation reforming the certification process, requiring greater FAA involvement and oversight. International regulators began conducting more independent reviews rather than automatically accepting FAA certifications. The changes acknowledged a hard truth: the old system, which had worked for decades, had failed catastrophically when commercial pressures overwhelmed engineering judgment and regulatory vigilance. One of the most contentious issues was pilot training. Boeing had designed the MAX to require minimal additional training for pilots certified on earlier 737s. This wasn't merely convenience, it was central to the aircraft's business case. airlines could deploy the MAX immediately without expensive simulator sessions. But the crashes revealed that pilots needed to understand MCOS and how to respond when it malfunctioned. After the grounding, regulators required specific MAX training, including simulator time. Boeing's attempt to minimize training requirements had backfired spectacularly, contributing to 346 deaths. The crashes illuminated a broader challenge in modern aviation, the automation paradox. As aircraft become more automated, pilots have fewer opportunities to manually fly and maintain hands-on skills. When automation fails or behaves unexpectedly, pilots must instantly understand complex systems and take corrective action. But if they don't know the automation exists or how it works, as with MCOS, they cannot respond effectively. The paradox is that increased automation, intended to improve safety, can sometimes reduce it by creating new failure modes that pilots are unprepared to handle. Aviation has long relied on redundancy. Critical systems typically have backups, and sensors are cross-checked against each other. Boeing's decision to have MCOS rely on a single angle of attack sensor violated this principle. The company later explained that existing runaway stabilizer procedures should have allowed pilots to handle MCOS malfunctions, so additional redundancy wasn't necessary. But this reasoning proved fatally flawed. A system powerful enough to crash an aircraft should have had multiple layers of protection. The single sensor design reflected cost and schedule pressures that led Boeing to accept risks that, in hindsight, were unacceptable. Investigators identified a phenomenon called normalization of deviance. As Boeing developed the MAX under intense schedule pressure, small deviations from best practices were accepted and rationalized. Each decision, relying on one sensor, not emphasizing MCOS in training, minimizing pilot documentation, seemed defensible in isolation. But collectively, they created a system vulnerable to catastrophic failure. Each compromise made the next one easier to accept. The corporate culture had evolved to prioritize meeting deadlines and cost targets, and safety margins eroded incrementally. Nobody decided to build an unsafe aircraft. But that's what happened. Boeing's leadership faced relentless pressure from Wall Street to maximize shareholder returns. The company had committed to aggressive stock buyback programs, spending billions to repurchase its own shares and boost stock prices. Some critics argued this diverted resources that could have funded a clean-sheet aircraft design instead of the compromised MAX. Boeing executives denied that financial engineering affected aircraft engineering. But the timeline suggested otherwise. The decision to upgrade the 737 rather than design a new aircraft came as Boeing allocated tens of billions to buybacks and dividends rather than research and development. Current and former Boeing employees came forward with disturbing accounts of a culture that discouraged raising safety concerns. Engineers described pressure to approve designs they had reservations about. Quality inspectors reported being sidelined when they identified problems. Some whistleblowers faced retaliation. Their testimonies painted a picture of a company where schedule and cost had become more important than engineering rigor. Boeing disputed these characterizations, but the pattern was consistent. When employees raised red flags, they were often ignored or marginalized. The company's once vaunted safety culture had been compromised. The MAX crisis had unexpected geopolitical dimensions. China, both a major buyer of Boeing aircraft and home to Boeing's competitor Comac, was first to ground the MAX and last to return it to service. Some analysts saw this as China leveraging a safety crisis for competitive advantage. The crashes also damaged American aviation's global prestige. For decades, a FAA certification had been the gold standard worldwide. After the MAX, other countries' regulators conducted extensive independent reviews, effectively rejecting the FAA's primacy. American aviation's credibility, built over generations, suffered a blow that extended beyond Boeing to U.S. regulatory authority itself. Boeing's crisis was Airbus's opportunity. While the MAX sat grounded, Airbus continued delivering A320neos and secured orders that might otherwise have gone to Boeing. By 2021, Airbus had overtaken Boeing as the world's largest aircraft manufacturer by deliveries. The competitive landscape had shifted. Airlines that had been exclusively Boeing customers began diversifying their fleets with Airbus aircraft. The duopoly remained, but the balance of power had changed. Boeing's self-inflicted wounds had handed its rival a historic advantage, one that might take decades to overcome. The 737 MAX flies today, operated by airlines worldwide. The redesigned MCOS system incorporates the safety features that should have been there from the beginning. Pilots receive proper training. The aircraft's performance matches Boeing's original promises of efficiency and reliability. By most measures, the MAX is now a safe aircraft. But its history cannot be erased. Every MAX flight carries the weight of 346 lives lost, and the knowledge that those deaths resulted not from unforeseeable technical failures, but from predictable consequences of corporate decisions that prioritized business objectives over safety margins. Memorials to the victims stand in Ethiopia and Indonesia. Families continue to grieve losses that should never have occurred. Some family members have become advocates for aviation safety, working to ensure that the lessons of the MAX crashes lead to meaningful change. Their advocacy has contributed to regulatory reforms and greater transparency in aircraft certification. The victims' names are read at aviation safety conferences, a solemn reminder of what's at stake when safety culture erodes. For these families, the MAX crisis is not a case study or a business story. It is an ongoing tragedy. Congress passed the Aircraft Certification, Safety, and Accountability Act in 2020. The law mandates greater FAA involvement in certification, limits manufacturers' self-assessment authority, and requires safety management systems. It establishes new protections for employees who raise safety concerns and increases penalties for violations. Internationally, regulators have formalized processes for independent validation of aircraft certifications, reducing reliance on any single authority. The reforms represent the most significant changes to aviation safety oversight in decades. Whether they go far enough remains debated. But they acknowledge that the old system failed and change is necessary. Boeing has publicly committed to rebuilding its safety culture. New leadership has emphasized engineering priorities over financial metrics. The company established a safety organization that reports directly to the board of directors. Boeing increased investment in employee training and created channels for raising concerns without retaliation. Skeptics note that cultural change is difficult and takes years to achieve. Critics point to subsequent quality issues in other Boeing programs as evidence that problems persist. Boeing's engineers and workers, many of whom were horrified by the MAX crashes, hope the company can reclaim its reputation for excellence. Time will tell. The MAX crisis raises fundamental questions about commercial aviation's business model. The industry operates on thin margins where small efficiency gains translate to competitive advantage. This creates intense pressure to minimize costs and accelerate development timelines. But when these pressures compromise safety, the consequences can be catastrophic, not just in human terms, but financially. Boeing's MAX crisis cost the company over $20 billion, dwarfing whatever savings were achieved by design shortcuts and avoiding simulator training requirements. The crashes demonstrated that compromising safety is not just morally wrong, it's economically disastrous. The 737 MAX story extends beyond aviation. It illustrates how organizations under competitive and financial pressure can drift toward disaster through incremental decisions that each seem reasonable in isolation. It shows how regulatory capture, where regulators become too close to the industries they oversee, can undermine public safety. It demonstrates that even experienced, reputable companies can lose their way when financial metrics overshadow core values. These lessons apply to any complex, safety-critical industry: automotive, pharmaceutical, nuclear, chemical. The warning is clear: culture matters, incentives matter, and small compromises can cascade into catastrophe. At every stage of the MAX story, human decisions shaped the outcome. Engineers who raised concerns but were overruled. Managers who prioritized schedules over safety margins. Regulators who trusted too much and verified too little. Executives who focused on stock prices over engineering excellence. Pilots who fought desperately to save their aircraft and passengers. And 346 people who simply boarded a plane, trusting that the complex systems ensuring their safety were functioning as intended. The MAX crashes weren't caused by mysterious technical failures. They resulted from human choices. Different choices would have meant different outcomes. The crashes damaged public trust in aviation technology and automation. Passengers began questioning whether modern aircraft had become too complex, too automated, too dependent on software that pilots might not fully understand. Some travelers actively avoided the MAX even after it returned to service. This trust deficit reflects a broader unease about technology in safety-critical applications. As artificial intelligence and increasing automation spread across industries, the MAX serves as a cautionary tale. Technology is only as trustworthy as the human systems, corporate cultures, regulatory oversight, engineering discipline, that create and deploy it. Despite criminal charges against Boeing's former chief technical pilot, no senior executives faced criminal prosecution for the MAX crashes. The Department of Justice settlement included a deferred prosecution agreement that allowed Boeing to avoid a criminal trial. Critics argued this represented a failure of accountability, that corporations could cause hundreds of deaths through reckless decisions yet their leaders faced no personal consequences beyond resignation and reputation damage. Defenders noted that corporate criminal law is complex and proving individual culpability is difficult. The debate highlighted tensions between corporate responsibility and individual accountability that remain unresolved. Commercial aviation remains extraordinarily safe. The chances of dying in a commercial airline crash are roughly 1 in 11 million. The industry's safety record is a triumph of engineering, regulation, and operational discipline developed over decades. Yet this very success creates a paradox. As aviation becomes safer, the industry and public may become complacent, potentially eroding the vigilance that created the safety record in the first place. The MAX crashes occurred not despite aviation's safety culture, but during a period when commercial pressures and regulatory changes weakened that culture. Maintaining safety requires constant vigilance, not complacency bred by past success. The MAX crashes reignited debates about aircraft design philosophy. Airbus and Boeing have historically taken different approaches to automation. Airbus systems often prevent pilots from commanding the aircraft beyond safe flight parameters. The computer won't let you stall or overstress the aircraft. Boeing traditionally gave pilots more authority to override automation. The pilot is ultimately in charge. MCOS blurred this philosophy, creating a powerful automated system that could override pilot inputs without their knowledge. The result satisfied neither approach. It wasn't transparent pilot authority nor robust automated protection. It was an uncomfortable hybrid that reflected compromised design priorities. Investigative journalists played a crucial role in uncovering the MAX story. Reporters obtained internal Boeing documents, interviewed whistleblowers, and analyzed technical details that revealed the depth of the problems. Media coverage kept pressure on Boeing and regulators when both might have preferred to handle the crisis quietly. The reporting was technical and complex, requiring journalists to understand aerodynamics, software systems, and regulatory processes. This coverage demonstrated journalism's vital role in holding powerful corporations and government agencies accountable, especially in specialized domains where public understanding is limited and industry expertise can be used to obscure rather than illuminate. The MAX grounding's economic impact extended far beyond Boeing. Airlines lost billions in revenue from canceled flights and had to lease older, less efficient aircraft. Boeing's suppliers, employing thousands of workers, saw orders slow or stop. The company's stock price fell sharply, affecting retirement accounts and institutional investors. Aviation lessors holding MAX aircraft saw asset values plummet. The impacts rippled through the economy: hotels near Boeing facilities, restaurants serving workers, communities dependent on aerospace jobs. While Boeing bore primary responsibility, the economic pain was widely distributed, affecting people who had no role in the decisions that caused the crashes. Competition drives innovation and efficiency in commercial aviation. The rivalry between Boeing and Airbus has produced remarkable aircraft. But the MAX crashes revealed competition's dark side. When commercial pressures become intense enough, they can undermine safety. Boeing rushed the MAX to market to counter the Airbus Neo. This haste contributed to design compromises and inadequate testing. The paradox is that competition, which generally benefits consumers, can in extreme cases threaten the safety those consumers depend upon. Balancing competitive dynamics with safety requirements remains one of aviation's ongoing challenges, requiring strong regulatory oversight and corporate cultures that won't sacrifice safety for market advantage. With hindsight, the right path is clear. Boeing should have designed an all-new aircraft optimized for modern engines, even if it took longer and cost more. If upgrading the 737 was necessary, MCOS should have used both sensors with robust redundancy. The system should have been prominently documented and included in pilot training. Boeing should have disclosed MCAS's existence and function to regulators, airlines, and pilots. The FAA should have conducted independent safety analysis rather than relying on Boeing's assessments. These steps would have prevented the crashes. They didn't happen because corporate culture, competitive pressure, and regulatory complacency created an environment where dangerous shortcuts seemed acceptable. Years after the crashes, questions remain. Has Boeing truly changed its culture, or merely its public messaging? Are regulatory reforms sufficient, or will commercial pressures eventually erode them? Will the aviation industry maintain the vigilance necessary to prevent similar disasters, or will time and competitive dynamics lead to new compromises? Have other aircraft been certified with similar shortcut approaches that simply haven't failed yet? These questions lack definitive answers. They require ongoing attention from regulators, journalists, safety advocates, and the flying public. The MAX crashes provide lessons, but only if those lessons are remembered and applied. The 737 MAX crashes teach a fundamental lesson that transcends aviation: safety is not a product of technology alone, but of the human systems and values that create and deploy that technology. The most sophisticated engineering means nothing if corporate culture prioritizes short-term business objectives over safety margins. The most detailed regulations fail if regulatory agencies lack resources or independence to enforce them. The best pilot training cannot overcome systems designed to hide critical information. Safety requires alignment of technology, culture, regulation, and values. When any element fails, disaster becomes possible. 346 people died because that alignment failed. Lion Air Flight 610 and Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302 carried people from dozens of countries. Students traveling to university. Business executives heading to meetings. Aid workers en route to humanitarian projects. Families on vacation. Each person had a life, dreams, people who loved them. They trusted that when they boarded a brand new Boeing aircraft, the plane was safe. That trust was betrayed by a series of decisions made in boardrooms and engineering offices far from those aircraft. The technical details matter. The corporate failures matter. The regulatory breakdowns matter. But ultimately, what matters most are the 346 human beings who should still be alive. Aviation will continue evolving. New technologies will emerge. Competitive pressures will persist. The challenge is ensuring that the lessons of the 737 MAX are not forgotten as time passes and new priorities arise. This requires vigilant regulation, corporate cultures that genuinely prioritize safety, transparency between manufacturers and operators, and public engagement on aviation safety issues. It requires remembering that behind every safety statistic are human lives. The MAX crashes were not inevitable. They resulted from choices. Different choices in the future can prevent similar tragedies. That is the responsibility of everyone involved in commercial aviation, and the memorial the victims deserve. The story of Boeing's 737 MAX is not simply about engineering failures or regulatory breakdowns. It is about what happens when corporate culture erodes, when financial pressures override engineering judgment, when competitive dynamics become more important than safety margins, and when trust is betrayed. It is a story with clear villains, executives who prioritized profit over people, and heroes, whistleblowers who spoke truth to power, journalists who uncovered hidden documents, families who demanded accountability. Most of all, it is a tragedy that should never have happened, and a warning about what occurs when the human systems that ensure safety fail. 346 people paid the ultimate price for those failures.